Mr. Kenney, thank you so much for joining us on Hub Dialogues. It's
Great to be here. Thanks, Harrison.
So word on the street is you are back. I'm on the internet. I'm reading an Alberta journalist saying, surviving on locusts and wild honey in the political wilderness, Kenney has returned. Your long dormant Twitter account is online. You've re-entered the fray. Is the internet right? Is Jason Kenney truly back, sir?
I'm not back in public life, but maybe a little bit more back in public commentary. I determined when I left public life, elected life, after 25 years elected, and really 30 plus years in the public eye, because I helped to start the Taxpayers Federation before that. I determined I was not going to become a pundit. I see a lot of my former colleagues doing those afternoon commentary shows and whatnot, and I thought, look, I've had my say. People know what I think on the big issues. I don't need to be running to a microphone to feel relevant or satisfied. So I really scaled back. Now, having said that, I don't want to completely lose my public voice on some big issues that really matter to me, on which I hopefully have a certain degree of expertise or depth on immigration, on labor markets.
Conservatism?
Conservatism, certainly, defense and national security, and a couple of issues about which I feel particularly passionate, Ukraine and Israel. So I have made exceptions, but I've been doing a little bit more of that stuff. I will say what caused me to jump back into the open sewer of X/Twitter was the day that Trump humiliated Zelensky in the Oval Office, and it was the same week that we had the peak of tariff madness from Trump, and the 51st state, the attacks on Canada. Look, I've always basically been a never Trumper, and that just for me was just too far. And I just felt not enough Canadian conservatives were calling out what was happening, and I had to jump in the fray. I trying to do it without, the problem with Twitter and these social media platforms is, of course, they can literally be addictive, right? We all know
Two addicts are sitting right here, I think.
Well, I'll come and go. I'm trying to really hard only to have 1 or 2 drinks a week in that sense.
Okay, let's talk about Alberta. We got the Canadian and Albertan flags close together, I might add, in the shot behind us.
Love it.
But I'm looking at Angus Reid polls showing 36% of Albertans support the idea of Alberta leaving Canada, 65% of United Conservative Party voters. And I'm just interested in how you view this emotion, this urge. Is this thousands of Albertans wanting to actually separate from Canada, or is this just the loudest, sharpest weapon you can use to express Western alienation, frustration with damn Ottawa, etc.?
Much more the latter than the former, much more about frustration and alienation than actual hard separation sentiment. Look, I have been very active on the front lines of the right of Alberta politics since 1991, since I helped to start the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in every respect. Grassroots, movement stuff, Reform MP, and every aspect of the movement. I created the United Conservative Party. So believe you me, I know these movements and who the actors are. So I would say, look, separatism started as a movement formally or deliberately sort of around 1980, around the time of the National Energy Program. And since then, there have been about a dozen federal elections and a dozen provincial elections in Alberta. So by my count, about 1,600 seats have been open since available to elect separatists in those ensuing 50 plus years and 45 years. And in all of that time, 1,600 seats, 24 elections, federal and provincial in Alberta, the Separatists elected one person, Gordon Kessler, to the Western Canada Conservative Party in a by-election in central Alberta in 1982 at the height of the National Energy Program and at the height of Pierre Trudeau's unpopularity. And that guy was defeated in the next general election. You just roll the clock back to 2021 federal election, a former Harper minister, so a guy with some ostensible credibility, Jay Hill, formed and led a separatist party called the Maverick Party, quite appropriately. And they thought they had, this big populist energy behind them. Candidates on the ballot across the 95 ridings of Western Canada, and between them they got like 0.2% or 0.02% of the vote. It was like 35,000 votes in all of Western Canada. So that shows you what the real hardcore separatist sentiment is. Now, you put it on a ballot, my assessment is the hard separatist sentiment ceiling is 15 to 20% in Alberta. But we are seeing these polls you just alluded to showing 35, 45% conditional support. The increment, the margin between, let's say, 15 and 45% support, that increment are what I call frustrated federalists. They don't really want to separate. They know it's a crackpot idea and it wouldn't really work, being landlocked and everything else. But they look to Quebec and they say, hey, the knife to the throat strategy has worked pretty well. Quebec got all the lolly, all the cake through asymmetric federalism, through these sustained threats of separation. Why don't we play that game? Some people, they use that just, it's kind of barstool separationism, secessionism. It's like just a colorful, aggressive opinion. I'm not sure they'd actually pull the lever on that. But Federalists shouldn't sleepwalk into this, because if you were not to take it seriously, if there is a referendum, and Federalists have a low turnout, and then a lot of people decide, yeah, separation is crazy, but I don't like the current arrangement, so we're going to send Ottawa a message. You could get a fairly high number that would, I regret, become a very divisive and permanent fact in Canadian politics.
Yeah, the number doesn't have to go above majority for it to be a problem for Federalists.
Well, no, just the very fact that these guys might get a referendum, even if they were to get a pathetically low number, let's say 90-10 or 85-15 on a no vote, the very fact that there would be a referendum would be massively divisive and in an enduring way. These things are basically like a nonviolent civil war. You will have members that will never talk to each other again. I swear to God, you'll have couples that break up over this, where the wife will typically go and vote for Canada, and the husband will vote for separation. No, it will happen. It will make the divisions that happen in society during COVID, I think, like a walk in the frickin' park. There will be business partners that never talk again. There will be huge business uncertainty, investor uncertainty. I was asked about it at a Wall Street conference in New York a couple of weeks ago, and I'll tell you, half of Albertans were born outside the province. I always say Alberta is the most Canadian province because of the huge
and people
migration.
Keep coming. Yeah,
the huge interprovincial migration, way higher than any other province. So if you go door knocking in a referendum campaign in Fort McMurray or Calgary or Red Deer, you're going to find every other door is somebody who came from Quebec or BC or Ontario, whatever. So they are Canadians first, overwhelmingly, that population. And a lot of those people say to me, who the hell do these people think they are? Like, I moved to Alberta to become an Albertan but a proud Canadian. Who do they think they are to try to throw me out of my own country? And then you have international immigrants who have come in large number, disproportionately large numbers to Alberta. And of course, overwhelmingly, their primary loyalty is to Canada. I'll put another piece on this table, which really concerns me about social division. If you look at the pictures of people going to separatist rallies, they look like a demographic picture of Alberta, like rural Alberta 50 years ago. Like they are, let's just put it this way. I'm trying to be politically correct. There is no diversity to speak of. And I am really concerned you're going to end up with like 98%, if there's a referendum, 98% of new Canadians and people from visible minority backgrounds voting for national unity. And that's going to create, for the first time ever in our history, a totally unnecessary divide along ethnic origins. And that's super nasty. We saw it in Quebec. Maybe it's more explicable in Quebec because there's an explicable reason for ethno-nationalism, right? French Canadians have that sense of being part of a people. I don't want us, for God's sakes, in 2025, we've got bigger things to deal with. Let's focus on leading the Federation, not leaving it. I think that's where most Albertans are, and I really regret that this thing could become hugely divisive and destructive.
So you call these ideas playing with fire. But I note that Premier Smith says she would support any citizen-led referendum petition that gets the numbers of signatures needed to trigger one. This was after she lowered the number of signatures required to trigger this hypothetical referendum. So is she playing with fire? What do you make of this? I say this as well, noting what you've described, which is there's a segment of the UCP base, which I know you more than anyone knows about, that you have to deal with as Premier of that province right now.
The role of a premier is to lead, and I'll tell you this. First of all, when I created the United Conservative Party, I wrote into the founding document that the UCP believes in a strong Alberta within a united Canada. And that was ratified in a 90% grassroots vote in both the PC and Wild Rose successor party or predecessor parties. And so that was a founding principle. I don't believe that my successor ran on a platform of opening up the question of pulling Alberta out of Canada. Now, I did bring in, per a platform commitment and per my longstanding belief in a judicious use of direct democracy, I brought in a citizen-initiated referendum law. Very interesting sidebar. Alberta had one since the early 20s under the progressive movement with all the direct democracy, recall, and initiative stuff. And then Ernst Manning, I'm talking to you, Preston, Ernst Manning in 1958 as premier repealed the Citizens Initiative referendum law because he really believed in the delegated model of parliamentary democracy and not direct democracy, apparently. And so I brought back Citizens Initiative. But I said in that we said in that legislation that for referenda that would result in constitutional amendments, which of course include separation, secession, you would have to get 20% of eligible voters in, I think it said in 3/5 of the constituencies, and have to do it in 30 days. So yeah, it was a high threshold. But the point was, I was saying,
and now, just so people know, 10% of eligible voters in the previous election within 120 days, I believe.
With no regional division. So with no regional requirement, which means it could all come from one region, let's say parts of rural Alberta. It could theoretically come with zero support from the cities or vice versa. So that could be regionally divisive. And effectively, the thresholds have been lowered so dramatically. Here's my concern. This is a movement I've just described. Like there have been fringe separatist parties coming and going on the ballot, federally and provincially, as I mentioned, for 45 years. Usually they fold because they're so disorganized they can't even register their annual reports, or they always fight amongst each other. They're constantly scrapping, including the separatist groups right now. They have no agreement on what they want. Some are talking about like quasi-sovereignty association, others hard separation, others 51st state. You put 5 of these people in the room and there's at least 8 opinions. So they've always been there on the margins of Alberta. But as I just told you, look, we just had a federal election where every Albertan voted for a Federalist Party. I don't know, maybe there was 1 or 2 independent rogue secessionist candidates, but I believe 100% of Albertans voted for Federalist parties. In the 2021 federal election, there was a Separatist Party in the ballot. It got 35,000 votes in all of Western Canada. So what I'm trying to convey to you is that's the real hardcore movement. I don't think they should be allowed to upend our entire society with a hugely divisive, when I say not allowed to, I think it's really imprudent to allow a tiny minority to dominate the entire political agenda for several months that will have serious and enduring commercial consequences for investor confidence in Alberta, drive a huge wedge through our society. I think if you're going to be able to do that, you should meet a substantial threshold that shows you've got a substantial.
But if that's met, then you have to take it seriously, no? Because
if
it's actually
that's what I said to them.
Yeah.
I said to them through the Citizen Initiative law that I drafted, it's not impossible, but you damn well better have a very substantial portion of public opinion on side, and not a small sliver of it.
Yeah, and a clear sense of what you want to do. Mark Carney is from Alberta. Is he a friend of Alberta?
I should say I know Mr. Carney. I knew him back when he was at finance in Ottawa and as governor, and I believe he thinks he's a friend of Alberta. He regards himself as an Albertan in terms of his roots, and he did grow up not just in Alberta but also the Northwest Territories. So he does understand the regions, the resource regions of Canada, at a certain personal level. Whether he is going to make good on his the super high expectations of his aspirational rhetoric, build, baby, build, Canada's an energy superpower,
yep.
Building oil and gas pipelines, transforming the Canadian economy, that remains to be seen. I hope it happens. And he sure as heck is telling everybody this, including people in the oil patch.
And what is it? What do they think? Do they buy it?
So far they're optimistic. I'll give you an example. According to the Globe and Mail report on business, after the oil and gas CEOs wrote a very strong public letter just a week before the federal election about the need for deregulation for big projects to proceed, apparently, according to the Globe, Mr. Carney called the author of that letter, a brilliant oil sands investor, Adam Watrous, and according to this report, they met. Now, subsequent to that, Mr. Watrous and his company have made a Watrous Energy Fund, or they have made Strathcona Resources Limited is their main sub. They've made a acquisition offer for Meg. So this would create a very large producer of oil. And so, if you've got a super smart investor, if this is true, this report, I haven't talked to Adam about it, but if you have a super smart investor who, following his conversations with Carney, is willing to bet on a future of growth and increased production for the oil sands, that is the kind of signals that the people are getting. Okay? So there's a lot, but the expectations are extremely high. And so far, I've got to admit, I want to give the Prime Minister benefit of the doubt. Yeah. I just spent 3 days in Ottawa meeting with people, senior people in the government. So far, where's the beef? I mean, the cabinet was a huge disappointment, an enormous missed opportunity. Okay, one pro-business, pro-resource, ostensibly blue liberal, Tim Hodson, great speech at the Calgary Chamber of Commerce last week. But why bring back Stephen Guilbeault? I mean, this would be like, by the way, do you know Stephen Guilbeault was arrested for scaling the roof of Premier Klein's house, the Premier of Alberta's home? He is, to be honest, despised in Alberta because his entire adult life has been devoted to trying to shut down our largest industry and create economic devastation in our province. And right out of the gate, he comes out and says no pipelines, even though he has nothing to do with that. Gregor Robertson, who 5 minutes ago was an anti-pipeline New Democrat, is a senior member in this cabinet. I want to, by contrast, I say to my Liberal friends, remember the first Chrétien cabinet? Doug Young from New Brunswick, Paul Martin, John Manley, Brian Tobin, pro-resource. You had Anne McClellan, who was always an advocate for the oil sands. Roy McLaren, you had pro-business, pro-growth, blue liberals who were the dominant force in the Chrétien cabinet. When Jean Chrétien became prime minister, Canada was producing just over 2 million barrels a day of oil. Now we're producing 5 million plus. The difference, largely, is the huge growth in the oil sands that happened through projects approved under and incented by that team in the Chrétien government. The 90s, and I don't see that kind of team being assembled by Mr. Carney. So maybe he, and he keeps implying this, is going to use force majeure to force through major projects. But that is, frankly, not consistent with the Mark Carney of the UN, as the UN Climate Rapporteur and as the founder of the Global Banking Alliance on Net Zero, as the value of the book authors, as somebody who's been advocating decarbonization targets more aggressive than Justin Trudeau's. So we're all waiting to see.
Let's look at some of it. So you talk about barrels of oil. Let's look at numbers he might be looking at in terms of the lifespan of the oil and gas industry. The International Energy Agency says that according to current trends, global oil demand will peak just before 2030, then gradually drop. Do you think that timeline's accurate,
Absolutely
or is
wrong.
it
all of those?
bupkis?
All of those projections have proven to peak oil have proven to be off. We are supposed to, of the same groups that make these projections were saying we were going to hit peak oil 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Whenever I post something that's pro-energy on social media, I see all these smarty pant liberals saying, "Oh, we're already declining in global demand." No, we're not. We're at 1.4 million barrels a day, even in a soft global economy with demand diminishing. It continues to go up, and I'll tell you. You want to know why? Because there are 2/3 of the world's population still living in poverty in developing countries.
You're looking at Asia specifically, I assume.
Yes, exactly. Asia and Africa and much of Latin America. And they are going to continue to press forward towards industrialization, development. People want to go from poverty to a middle class. And that means affordable energy. It means affordable energy for industrial purposes and personal consumption. And that energy is going to be affordable and therefore dense forms of energy. In many parts of the developing world, it's going to mean coal. It would be much better if instead it meant natural gas-fired electricity. And on top of all of that, the electrification, which is a consequence of decarbonization, that is to say, like moving to electric car fleets, et cetera, and the AI revolution, which is a huge draw on energy for data processing, for blockchain and for crypto and for all of that. You take all of those forthcoming electricity demands. Well, I mean, we're going to need to burn a hell of a lot more, to be blunt about this, natural gas to meet those electrification demands, to do the decarbonization, to replace coal in particular, and to reduce emissions. These, by the way, this is not about political preferences or ideology. It is about physics. It's about math. It's about the limitations that we have. Just to meet a tripling of electricity demand in the next 20 years would require, as I understand it, the equivalent of 35 Site C dams. This huge mega project in northern BC, which is like many years behind schedule. Not going to happen. You cannot do it without natural gas, and oil is going to be a big part of that future for a good while to come. And here's the bottom line. Even if those projections are right, in a world with diminishing oil demand, let's say eventually 2050, we're at 50 million barrels a day of consumption, give or take. Do we want all of that production to come from Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Qatar? Or do we want a liberal democracy with the highest human rights, labor, and environmental standards on earth, like Canada, to play a major role in those future energy markets? I say global peace, security, and the environment are better off if we are the last barrel of oil that's demanded at some point in the future.
So what's your message to Alberta Oil and Gas? That it's sort of business as usual? Like, what should they be thinking of in terms of the future? Just, is it steady as she goes, more the same, or are there serious sort of decisions?
Yeah, there's very serious decisions. And I'll tell you, when I was Premier, I did everything I could to create optimal investment context to bring back investment to Alberta, because we had been under the NDP. The NDP was elected in 2015 in Alberta, Trudeau, same time in Ottawa. And at the same time, there was a downward price correction on commodity prices. So we had the Alberta economy was just hammered. We went from a GDP of $365 billion to $315 billion between 2015 and when I took office in 2019. So we'd lost massive ground. We went from being the second largest economy in Canada, ahead of Quebec, to the third largest, behind Quebec, which hurts. And so, we needed to turn it around. So I cut corporate taxes by 1/3. We did massive deregulation. We cut our regulatory burden by over 1/3. We did unilateral free trade with the other Canadian provinces, eliminated essentially all of our exemptions under the Canada Trade Agreement. We created an investment agency. I was doing road shows all around the world to bring investment to Alberta, and it really started to turn it around. But we did not see any significant new capital investment in the oil sands, which is the 500-pound gorilla in the Canadian economy. By the way, one of the reasons that Canada got through the global financial crisis of 2008 more resiliently than any G7 or OECD country was in large part because there was still large capital investment going on to expand production of oil in the Alberta oil sands. These big mega projects got us through that and helped to hold up our currency at that time. So this is and by the way, for Ontario, if indeed the auto sector here is going to get clobbered by the implication of Trump tariffs and moving production to the United States, one way to help replace manufacturing jobs in central Canada is to get big capital spending going in the oil sands to build pipe, to build those big trucks, to build all the implements. It comes mainly from central Canada. This is a nation-building project. But we need optimal conditions for the boards of those big publicly traded oil sands companies, which are all now Canadian, although Imperial is owned mainly by Exxon, but they're all Canadian operating companies. We need the right policy circumstances to go forward with greenfield investment, because otherwise what's going to happen is they will just continue to buy back shares, pay down debt, strengthen their balance sheets, do incremental minor increases in their existing SAGD projects and mines. But eventually, the implication is we will start to see a reduction in Canadian production of oil, let's say 5 to 10 years from now. So we need new greenfield capital investment in the oil sands as a key issue to turn around the decline in Canadian productivity. That means lifting the emissions cap. It means at least one more oil pipeline. It means not hiking the industrial carbon tax to stratospheric levels that will make our industry totally uncompetitive. So those are some of the policies that need to be fixed. And Prime Minister, all eyes are on you.
I hope he's watching and listening. One of the reasons I think, or at least it seems you came off the sidelines and back onto the pitch, was to also talk about conservatism. You've described certain folks who you feel are unsavory, extreme, cruel. I know you used the word lunatics at one point. What concerns you about this part of the movement?
Yeah,
Why should I be looking and paying attention to these people?
The kind of people that I'm characterizing with those words are not conservatives in any way, shape, or form.
You won't even give them the title.
I call it right-wing Jacobinism. And for those not familiar with the term Jacobin, not to be confused with Jacobite, I'm a Jacobite, which is like a traditionalist. Jacobins were the people in the French Revolution that were responsible for the terror, and basically it's a revolutionary spirit to burn things down. It's based on a total distrust in institutions, and so I regret that we're seeing more and more of this. Look, let me share with you my theory about this. When I helped to start the Canadian Taxpayers Federation in the early 90s, we sold our memberships and raised our funds by having a door-to-door sales operation. Back in the day when we still had door-to-door salesmen. And every Friday afternoon I would meet with these guys. And they would always come back. And these were mainly working in rural Alberta and Saskatchewan. They would come back to me and they would say, how did it go? What are the questions? And every week one of them would say, came across a guy in the back 40 who, a crazy old coot, who handed me this brochure, and there's always a caricature of a hook-nosed Jewish banker and connected to some weird monetary gold policy conspiracy. And I think back on that. Those guys were like the nasty dregs of the dark side of social credit, which had Ernst Manning expelled them, but they still continued to circulate their crazy ideas. But in those days, Harrison, if they wrote a letter, a Jew-hating letter to the local paper, it wouldn't get published. If they called the AM talk radio show, they'd get cut off. With the advent of social media circa 2000, suddenly those folks can all self-publish. And I'm not just talking about anti-Semitic monetary policy concerns, but people with a conspiratorial mind or people with like a total rejection of institutions could find each other, create their own silos of information. Then on the right, we had a growing, and I think understandable, distrust in institutional legacy media. And so alt-right media stepped into that to fill that market vacuum.
Will you name names or no?
Well, Fox in the U.S. and arguably the rebel and alt-right media here, mainly online here. I do not include the Hub in this.
Thank you, sir.
I think you guys are a very constructive response to this phenomenon. And so my view is that those alt-right media, their business model became the monetization of anger, which required keeping their consumers in ever higher registers of anger. And so you have the social media function, you have the alt-right media, really with increasingly toxic content. Then you have things like COVID, which if you have a conspiratorial mind, it does look like all of a sudden all of the world's scientific, academic, cultural, media, political, medical elites conspired to disrupt your life, suspend the exercise of some of your liberties. And so that seems like a validation of a lot of these theories. And then, Trump comes along. He won't even condemn QAnon. So you've got the most powerful man in the world, in a way, validating some of your conspiratorial views. I think that's created a mindset, and it's a relatively small share of the population, but they're very loud on social media. And as I discovered in the United Conservative Party, I mean, I'll just be blunt about this. Theo Fleury, a former Calgary Flames player and captain, great Canadian hockey player, is I would argue, the most prominent Canadian proponent of the QAnon conspiracy theory, the adrenochrome and all this craziness. He's actually endorsed prominent people who are in public office right now have willingly received his endorsement. So this stuff, I think, is absolutely toxic. And as somebody who spent my entire adult life in the conservative movement, trying to build a principled but electable conservative approach to conservatism, I'm not going to be silent when I see these attitudes infecting the parties and the movement that I've spent so much time in.
Let me try and embody them just for a second. Humor me with this. So they would say, listen, some of us are citizens. We look at every institution of authority. We think it doesn't share our values. This is because, for example, let's say you're a pro-life Canadian looking at a healthcare system that recommends MAID. Someone who lost a family member to opioids because Oxycontin was overprescribed, watches the media and doesn't trust them because of underreporting on Biden or Indigenous graves. What's your response to them when they say, why should I still trust these institutions that we should support?
So, by the way, you just described me on all 3 points. I'm a pro-life Canadian who thinks that the euthanasia regime in Canada is grotesque. I think that a lot of this negative reaction on the right has been fueled by institutional capture of many on the left, of many legacy media platforms. As Premier, I brought in the alternative to the kind of radical harm reduction and safe supply approach, which is a totally different approach to support.
So what makes you still trust the institutions rather than them?
It doesn't mean I trust all of these self-proclaimed elites or all of the self-proclaimed experts. I think there's been a huge credential inflation. And I agree that we need, frankly, voices like the Hub to responsibly question some of these elites when they feed us a bill of goods. And that's the normal function of a conservative movement at a time where the left has captured so many institutions. But to burn it all down is not the solution. I mean, I see, like, for example, I'll give you one example. We just welcomed His Majesty the King to Canada for to deliver the throne speech. And you will have seen online you've seen in the polls that now a majority of Conservative Party voters are opposed to the Canadian Crown.
Really?
What? How the hell did that happen?
When did that happen?
Yeah, no, the Conservative Party was always the party of the Crown. And so here's a politically neutral institution to which you cannot ascribe any of these social problems. And it represents stability, order, continuity, tradition, unity. It is the characteristic Canadian institution. The United Empire Loyalists who founded English Canada were devoted to the Crown. The French Canadians who were protected by the Quebec Act from the American Revolution and were protected by the Crown from the American Revolution, the Crown that allowed them to maintain the French Catholic cultures, the civil code, the French language, and all of that. Canada was founded in loyalty to the Crown, and the Conservative Party was its central touchstone. And now you suddenly have a majority of Conservative voters saying that they're Republicans, small r. What the hell happened? One, I think the growing impact or influence of this kind of right-wing Jacobinism, this rejection of all institutions, and the desire to burn them down. Secondly, I think the migration of a lot of older voters to the Liberal Party because of the first point. A lot of older voters who are traditional conservatives who now see the Liberal Party as the party of institutional conservatism. And I think that's a real problem. That's what I'm talking about. I agree with the frustration that people have on all of the issues you've mentioned. But what we have to do as a movement is get behind the wheel constructively and productively, making the case against things like extremism in euthanasia, extremism in drug and addictions policy, bad economic policy that is driving down our productivity and our national wealth, soft on crime policies. Like Tristan Hopper and his book,
Don't Be Canada.
Yeah, Don't Be Canada. I basically agree with virtually everything he says about his critique about contemporary Canadian liberal elites. I am somebody who believes in taking the fight to them, not burning down the institutions of our that we have inherited, which have made Canada, despite all of its flaws, a great country.
How should politicians deal with these folks? And deal may seem, I don't know, unfair here, but, engage with them because, we've seen Hillary Clinton's basket of deplorables. Prime Minister Trudeau called a bunch of the truckers fringe minority with unacceptable views. How should politicians be talking to them in a helpful way, do you think?
Well, I think an alternative vision is the most attractive thing, a positive alternative vision. To be honest, look, despite significant growth in Conservative Party support in the last federal election and the 41% and all of those achievements and broadening into a bigger blue-collar coalition, all of those good things, we Conservatives came up short. And I think one of the reasons is that Mr. Poilievre was the most effective opposition leader of post-war Canadian history. So effective as opposition leader, taking down Justin Trudeau, defining the issue matrix and so forth, that a lot of voters saw him as only an opposition leader. And I think if he had made an effort earlier to modify his tone and approach to be more prime ministerial, for example,
what would that look
more
like?
aspirational, well, I'll tell you, I mean, if I were in his shoes a year ago, easy to say, not trying to, I guess I'm being an armchair quarterback here, but I would have gone down to Washington a year ago, met with Hakeem Jeffries, Chuck Schumer, Speaker Johnson, and Mitch McConnell, and I would have met Secretary of State, the State Department, given a speech at Brookings or AEI on the incredible success of NAFTA and North American trade to move the Conservative Party clearly away from the MAGA protectionism. I would have been on a plane and gone to meet Conservative Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and given a speech at Policy Exchange in London about the special relationship, about NATO. And I would have gone to Kiev and met Vladimir Zelensky and committed Canada's continued support under a Conservative government, as other opposition leaders around the world have done. Things like that, which would have conveyed a readiness to be the head of government of a G7 country. Now, I don't want to be, please don't get me wrong, I don't want to be too critical. I think Pierre's achievements here were phenomenal. And the growth of this kind of new blue-collar conservative coalition of people who do feel, and are right to feel, that the country has not been working for them. People whose real incomes have been stagnating or declining, who can never afford home ownership, who are in neighborhoods most likely to be afflicted by the addictions crisis and by criminality, who are the most vulnerable to the declining quality of public services from healthcare to education. Damn right people have a right to expect and demand more. And he's been a very effective voice for them. I'm simply suggesting that at the end of the day, if you want to form majority governments in Canada, you have to present both a tone and a program that is ready to govern.
Well, this is one of the final themes I wanted to touch on is, there's external factors outside of the Conservatives, which are Trump coming onto the scene, Trudeau leaving the scene. Great loss in terms of a foil as a Conservative leader. But what was it in particular about the party and the leader, Mr. Poilievre, that you think ultimately meant they couldn't cross the finish line after being so high in the polls only months ago?
I honestly think it became an election about vibes. I don't think there were huge policy differences. There weren't. Particularly on the big question of Trump. They both supported dollar for dollar targeted reciprocal tariffs. They both rejected, obviously, the 51st state nonsense. They both said we need to be strong about this and take a united approach. I think both rhetorically and substantively, there was virtually no daylight between them on the approach to Trump. And even on fiscal and economic policy, the differences were differences of degree, not differences of kind. Mr. Poilievre adopted the new Trudeau entitlement programs and dental and pharma and a deficit in the future, et cetera. I mean, there were obviously some differences, but I don't really think you can ascribe this to some big conflict over some huge ideological choice. I think that, as I said, Mr. Poilievre demonstrated his enormous effectiveness as an opposition leader, and I think he became associated in the minds of the public as a very effective opposition leader. Then we have, then suddenly the widely reviled Trudeau leaves the stage. The Liberals engineer to bring in this guy who looks like a hyper-competent, grounded, mature, and calm leader from Hollywood Central Casting with deep financial and economic experience, a safe pair of hands. People want to change? Well, the Liberal message was, here's change. They wanted safe change. The Liberal message was, here's safe change. And so I think for boomers in particular, and I think another aspect of this, in terms of what I call the vibes election, is where people get their information from. And I was talking to a very senior Liberal this week in Ottawa who said what I think is obvious, that the 50-plus voters are still plugged in to legacy media. That's where they get their information. Legacy media are not typically very favorable to Mr. Poilievre. And I think in some respects they gave Mr. Carney a bit of a free pass. Under 50 voters, this senior Liberal said to me, are overwhelmingly disengaged in terms of what's going on in politics. And to the extent that they get information, it's usually from social media. So you had basically, you want to simplify this, social media voters voting Conservative, legacy institutional media voters voting Liberal. You had people who have been the biggest victims of the housing crisis and all of the social disorder wanting more aggressive change. Yeah, and the people who have done fairly well in the housing market, frankly, being more, in a sense, small c conservative, wanting to preserve their gains. I think that's what it was. So I don't think there was any huge tactical error on the part of Mr. Poilievre of the Conservative campaign. I think they did their best with a really difficult set of circumstances. Now they need to figure out how to graft onto that 41%, 3 or 4% more, that look more like moms in Oakville than guys wearing hard hats in Windsor.
Well, you predicted my next question in terms of where people get information. There's been a lot of debate around whether Conservatives should do mainstream media, which is perceived as, I think objectively, it leans left. Conservatives feel like it's biased. They're not going to get a fair shake. And the audiences are so low. But you say include, those valuable boomer votes, perhaps. Jenny Byrne said this was going to be the most transparent campaign ever. They ended up not having media come along for the campaign. They didn't really engage with mainstream media. On election night, you were on CBC for hours.
Yeah.
Why do you think this is
for my
worth
sins?
Doing? So tell me why it's important that Conservatives still appear on these platforms.
Well, that's exactly why I did it. I mean, it seems kind of counterintuitive, but I did it, because I thought it was important to have a Conservative who could defend against CBC bias, which I think is a real thing. Some people will have seen clips of me and Rosemary Barton going back and forth on a few points, for example, where she incorrectly tried to fact check me. So I thought it was important to have somebody doing that. Secondly, I thought it was also important to send a message to use that platform to send a message to Conservatives about the need for us to avoid the perhaps for some people the seductive anger of MAGA-styled populism. And thirdly, I thought it was important to remind the millions of boomers and fairly mainstream Canadians who watch CBC that Conservatives are not that caricature, that there are Conservatives like, by the way, I want to remind you, I mean, all of a sudden I've been redefined as a rhino or a Conservative in name only, or according to my Twitter feed, I'm a liberal, I'm a WEFer, globalist, all of these things, a leftist. I've spent my entire life, helped to found the Canadian Taxpayers Federation on just about every issue, cultural and social issues, foreign policy and security issues, fiscal and economic policy. Through the 10 years of the Harper government, I was broadly considered to be perhaps the most right-wing member of his cabinet, or certainly one of them. I've been ideological ballast all along.
You haven't changed.
No, I know. And if you look at the platform that I ran on, the things I implemented in Alberta,
but maybe they've got harsher. Maybe they're moving further right.
I don't know another government in Canada that in the last 20 years has actually cut spending in absolute terms as I did, that cut corporate taxes, that brought in more school choice, that expanded healthcare choice with the chartered surgical facilities, and so that challenged the dogma on safe supply and harm reduction and so on. So I have no excuses to make. I don't have to apologize. I'm not some kind of a squishy person who's not prepared to have a fight. But my point is, as conservatives, we believe in building things, not tearing them down. We believe in patriotism, not secession. We believe in the institutions that are the center of our public life, including, for example, the Crown. We believe in community and not radical individualism. We believe in a certain level of social solidarity and not total radical personal autonomy. At least that's my vision of conservatism. And I'm not going to shut up about it.
Just my final couple questions here. Answer this for me, because this is strange and maybe it speaks to different cultures across this country. During the COVID-19 pandemic, there's a conservative government here in Ontario and a conservative one in Alberta, which you were leading. Both faced intense criticism over just impossible pandemic policies and reversals. Both faced internal rebellions. There were a couple parties, no more than a few members, that popped up here on the right in Ontario. COVID-19 defined the end of your premiership and contributed to your exit from politics. Meanwhile, Doug Ford here wins his third straight majority government. What accounts for that?
Well, let me
difference?
add to that. He kicked 5 or 6 MPPs out of caucus for going offside on COVID policy, and they formed or supported 2 alt-right parties, the New Blue and the Ontario Party, I think, who between them got 3.2% of the vote in an election after what I thought were, frankly, unreasonably hard lockdown policies in Ontario. And he wins an increased majority, crushes the Liberal Party, a huge electoral vindication of what he did during COVID. I actually think that that's where the broad public was.
In both provinces?
Well, to some extent. And Alberta has got more of a libertarian sensibility. In our polling, pretty consistently during COVID in Alberta, which we did a lot of, we saw that typically 40% of the public thought our government was too slow and reluctant to impose restrictions. About 40% were prepared to say we got it more or less right, but 20% pretty consistently thought we were too restrictive. So you had this polarization. The thing about that 20% is within that, there was, in particular amongst the hardcore anti-vax crowd, which is only like less than 5% of the population, highly, highly motivated. And they got involved. And what I discovered is they would crawl over broken glass to take down what they regarded as this globalist conspiracy to impose the deadly jab that, the Klaus Schwab World Economic Forum agenda that was driving to depopulate the world, all of this stuff, which is like QAnon adjacent. Mm-hmm. And that was like, by the way, my leadership review vote in the spring of 2021, 2/3 of the people voting in that had never been members of the United Conservative Party, the Progressive Conservative Party, or the Wild Rose Party in Alberta. They were brand new. I suspect they were overwhelmingly people of that. And you know what?
Single issue voters.
Yeah. But at the end of the day, you know what I say? They're citizens. Like you said, they're citizens. They have a right to be involved in an open democratic process. So I don't have a beef with people for getting involved around their passion. I would just say this, though, Harrison, to all of the other conservatives, even if they thought maybe restrictions at times were unnecessary or too rigid, as I did, by the way, but if people want a brand of conservatism which is broadly mainstream, electable, believes in things like medical science, you need to get involved in the process. You can't sit on the sidelines and then be anxious about the results. So get involved in the process would be my message, because a lot of mainstream center-right Canadians have been sitting out the process.
So let's talk about you sitting out or sitting in. The last time you were asked about a political comeback, you said, "I'm enjoying life in the private sector. I've paid my dues. I don't expect to be going back into government." Then you used the classic political phrase of, "But I guess never say never." So, Mr. Kenney, how far is that door open or shut right now?
It's shut. I am enjoying, as I joke, kind of having a life, because I was in it for that world for so long. And now I have a lot more, I have privacy, freedom, and opportunity that I did not have during those many years of public service. I feel like when I say I paid my dues, I don't think people should stick around forever in those jobs like a bad cold.
Look what's happening in the U.S.
Exactly.
They're all, octogenarians.
Exactly. I don't want to be one of those guys. So, but when I said never say never, I meant like if we have Conservative government in the future and they ask me to do some important, really meaningful task, and I would have to consider it because I am a sucker for public service. I know it sounds hokey and cynics don't believe it, but people like me actually do believe in public service. But for the time being, I'm really enjoying having, as I say, freedom, privacy, opportunity, and doing new creative things. I'll tell you, going back to where I began, the Taxpayers Federation, when I was like 22, I joined that organization 35 years ago last week, and started the wing in Alberta, became president a couple of years later of the national group. We built it from more or less from scratch, and it was a startup. It was an entrepreneurial, it was a nonprofit startup. There was no rich exit day from that, but it was the entrepreneurial opportunity to create something and have no safety net. I love that. And so I love being in the
starting
private
a new
sector.
party. That's what we're going to see in the next year.
I already did that too. I love being involved in business for that reason, because you are in, it's one thing to be a champion of the free market and private and free enterprise in government. It's another to actually be in the private sector and to do it, to make the rubber hit the road. I'm having that opportunity right now, which is pretty cool.
Let's end with this, a familial connection. I don't know how many people know your grandfather.
Yeah.
Mart Kenney,
right,
was his name. He was a jazz music star in Canada in the 30s and 40s. One of his classics, and I was listening to it the other night on YouTube, a song called The West, A Nest, and You Dear. And I'm wondering if this is the love song we Ontarians should be singing to Albertans, given the environment we currently find ourselves in.
Well done. Yes, absolutely. And by the way, that was his theme song, and he led the most popular dance band, big band of the 1930s, 40s, and 50s in Canada. That song was a absolutely household. I remember doing an all candidates forum at a seniors home in Calgary, and I said to the crowd, and I was sitting there with my Liberal and NDP colleagues, I said, by the way, my grandpa was Mart Kenney, and I hear all these oohs and ahs. And I said, I suppose many of you met your husband or your wife on the dance floor dancing to his music, and they all nod. And I said, does anybody remember his theme song? And they all start singing The West, A Nest, and You Dear. That's how well known the song was. It's a great, yes. And here's the thing about my grandpa. He was a proud Canadian nationalist. He made it big. He did over 100 records, RCA Victor. He was live on the CBC every week for the better part of 30 years. He had an offer to go to the U.S. to work out of New York for NBC Radio and have an American record contract and make big money, like Lawrence Welk did, or these other big Canadian acts that went down. But he decided to stay in Canada because he always said he wanted to raise his family in Canada. I inherited both my sense of public service from him and my patriotism from him. And he's proved that Westerners are great Canadians.
There you go, a true patriot. And I'll be nice and I won't make you sing that song here at the end as we turn this podcast off. That is Jason Kenney, former Premier of Alberta, former federal cabinet minister in the Harper government. Thank you so much, Jason, for stopping by at the Hub and being so kind with your time.
Thanks, Harrison.